There's a beautiful dog park near our house where you can see the Pacific Ocean in the sunset. And when we were taking Bindu there, as we arrived, there were helicopters moving overhead. And that's not a good sign. And when we got to the park, people had learned that there had been a shootout in the neighborhood. And the street was one that we were familiar with because one of our friends in our community, son, who struggled with drugs and with mental illness, they lived on that block. And it turned out, yes, it had been him, and he'd been involved, and he wounded a policeman, and that, of course, mobilized people, and he ended up taking his own life. When we got to the park and there was that awareness spreading among the people, everyone stopped and became profoundly still. Now, that impulse to become still has a message for us. It's a message that comes from a very deep and intuitive place in our hearts because in moments of tragedy like that, we realize, wordlessly perhaps, that life is sacred, that all life is sacred. And we touch in the shock, in the grief, our heart breaks open, and we are aware of that. Now, we don't have to wait for tragic events to commune with the sacred, because what those moments of stillness also reveal is that the sacred nature, the sacred essence, the radiance is ever present. It's always available if we will make ourselves available to it. It is ever present. And communing with that and opening to that is not an achievement, and it doesn't require a tragedy. It doesn't require some kind of large event either. In a breath, we can reorient and remember that everything and everyone is sacred. But it takes the stillness. And the surface mind, the conditioned mind, does have a hard time with stillness in general, and particularly in times of difficulty, times like that, times of conflict, times of struggle, times of violence. The mind reacts. It's hardwired. Yes, the mind, after that moment of stillness, something needs to be done. Something needs to be done. Yes, something does need to be done. But to depart from that stillness too quickly moves us into reactivity, moves us into the conditioned programs of reactivity that have led to the very violence that we're seeking to correct. So we need to become, I would suggest, better students of and better stewards of stillness. We need to cultivate our capacity to not just be shocked into it, but to return to it intentionally, so that when tragedies and violence and struggles and protests and conflicts and politics churn, that we can be still and not rush to judgment or leap to activity, but rather that we can abide in the consciousness of the sacred, and from that consciousness return to the world with unclouded eyes and with an undefended heart, so that we can be available to receive the insights and the guidance of healing and actions of reknitting the fabric of our community lives together. We have been conditioned to act as if we are perpetual motion machines, jumping to conclusions, moving to action, never stopping, compulsion-driven kind of automatons, really. And it's impossible to recognize the sacred nature, the holy nature of life when we're in that pace. So I'm not suggesting stillness as a substitute for action, but rather stillness as a generative source from which actions that are healing and truly helpful can emerge. I'm suggesting that by cultivating your and our capacity for stillness, you and I, we, are actually serving the world. By deepening our attunement individually first and then collectively to the sacred which is ever present, we are establishing inner conditions that will allow us to take actions that, coming from wholeness, promote wholeness. And that is good, whether we're thinking globally or we're thinking around the dinner table with our families. There's no need to wait for the helicopters. There's no need. We can cultivate that capacity to abide in sacred presence now, daily, and thus prepare ourselves to meet life's inevitable ups and downs as healing agents in a world in need of that remembrance, of that sacred stillness.